We're getting a lot of Friday the 13th, but it's gonna be different. How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and in today's video, I'm gonna dig into everything going on with the Friday the 13th franchise, because like right under our noses, there have been a lot of deals being made that we didn't even know about until recently. So the weirdest thing that came out of this whole lawsuit with the Friday the 13th franchise between Victor Miller, the original writer, and Sean S. Cunningham, the guy behind Horror Inc., is that they each own different parts of the franchise because of how this whole thing came to be. So Victor Miller basically owns the US rights to everything in the original movie's script. So he owns the name Jason Voorhees, he owns the character Pamela Voorhees, he owns Camp Crystal Lake, all the stuff that basically is like the building blocks of the Friday the 13th franchise. Whereas Sean Cunningham and his company Horror Inc., they own everything related to adult Jason. So like the idea of a big guy in a hockey mask going around a summer camp murdering teenage counselors, that's what Sean Cunningham and Horror Inc. owns. So really, Victor Miller got the better deal here because he owns all the IP stuff related to Friday the 13th. It's pretty complicated because Sean Cunningham could wake up tomorrow and say, hey, I want to make a new Friday the 13th movie about a 6'5" zombie who's chasing people around a summer camp, murdering them with a machete while he's wearing a hockey mask. The only issue is he can't call the camp Camp Crystal Lake. He can't call that character Jason Voorhees. Pamela Voorhees can't be included in the lore unless he gets permission from Victor Miller. The silver lining here, though, obviously, and this is going to take a second to explain, is that Victor Miller, the whole reason this lawsuit happened, like that he started it in the first place, is because he didn't feel like he was paid or compensated fairly for the work he had contributed to the Friday the 13th franchise. Like, he came up with the original script in the beginning, and then the franchise really blew up after he left, and he felt like he didn't get enough money out of that, and he just ultimately, it seems like, really wants some money from this franchise in the future. And the best way to make money in the future on this franchise is for these two guys to throw down the axes, throw down, you know, the weapons that they've been holding at each other figuratively for years, and say, let's work together, we'll each split the profits here, and we'll both end up rich. But in the meantime, nothing's stopping Victor Miller from taking all these aspects of this IP he owns to another studio to create something new, and that's exactly what he's doing with Bryan Fuller and A24 over at Peacock, where they're making the Crystal Lake TV show. The whole setup for the show is pretty interesting. It's basically going to be a prequel and also a retelling of the first movie that focuses on the life and times of Pamela Voorhees and child Jason Voorhees. Now, they haven't really been clear on whether or not we're going to see adult Jason. I would guess we will, because that's what really is going to get people in the door. But from what we've heard, it's going to be focusing mostly, at the beginning at least, on Pamela Voorhees and child Jason Voorhees. Another interesting detail is that Adrienne King, who played the final girl in Friday the 13th Part 1, is coming back to have a recurring role on the show. And thanks to her, we now know that the show is filming and that it's coming out in 2024, because she tweeted that she's having a bunch of fun filming this show, and she put a hashtag that said coming in 2024. So that is that question answered as far as I'm concerned. And this is like an easy guess if you've ever watched the channel before, but from that description, I'm a little conflicted on this news, because to me, everything we've heard so far basically makes it sound like the new version of Bates Motel, right? Like the Friday the 13th version of Bates Motel. I think it's worth pointing out that I initially rolled my eyes at that show, but I honestly ended up loving it. I watched every season of it as soon as it became available, and it is an incredible show, a great use of those characters, and honestly, it fits with the Psycho lore a lot more than I feel like this idea for Camp Crystal Lake and Friday the 13th really does with that franchise. I'm just being real. And as much as I've ended up loving a lot of the more like highbrow, personal, like psychological sort of horror movies that have come out over the past decade and have been super popular, it's always kind of difficult for me to get excited to go see a lot of those movies, and a lot of the time I'm also leaving the theater disappointed. But there are examples where I do enjoy the movies. Like a recent one is Infinity Pool. I think everyone should check that movie out, because it's kind of like splitting the difference between this more like heady type of stuff and then actually having like a plot that you can follow and enjoy with some cool horror moments in it. I thought that movie was great. I didn't think it was going to be going in, and that's just a recent example. And while yeah, when you take these franchises that have been one thing in the past and you reshape them into something new, it has worked quite a few times. When you're talking about something like Halloween or or Hellraiser or Friday the 13th or A Nightmare on Elm Street. I just want to see a slasher movie where teenagers are being like graphically killed on screen, because that's what I grew up with, and that's why I like these franchises in the first place. So yeah, when I hear that Crystal Lake is being produced by A24 and it's going to focus on more of the first two movies in the franchise versus the third one through the rest of the franchise, yeah, it's hard for me to get as excited as I would be if it was going to be like a new revival of the slasher franchise that I grew up really liking on AMC Fear Fest. And it's especially weird when you consider that the reason these movies have always worked in the past is because even if they didn't hit meteoric success at the box office, they were able to turn a pretty healthy profit because they were cheap to make, until like the early 2000s when Platinum Dunes started pushing out a lot of remakes of these movies, like their Friday the 13th and their Nightmare on Elm Street. And I'm not complaining about that at all, because I like a lot of those remakes. I like the Amityville Horror one, I like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I like The Hills Have Eyes, I like The Last House on the Left, I like Friday the 13th 2009, House of Wax. There are so many of these remakes that are actually pretty awesome and get better the more I go back and watch them. But one thing I think you could attribute to the biggest change with those remakes being that they were pretty expensive to produce and didn't always turn a huge profit is that now a lot of these franchises are coming back as more highbrow stuff, like we're seeing with this Crystal Lake TV show. And this isn't like a hard set rule or anything, because on the other hand, we have stuff like the Halloween trilogy that just wrapped up, we have Megan, we have the new Scream movies. Like, there are examples of new slasher movies that are pretty similar to what we had in the past that generally work pretty well. I've just seen a lot of other examples like the ones I just mentioned. As far as Crystal Lake goes, I'm pretty excited for it. I just need a little bit more convincing, because it's taking A24 concepts and mixing it with a franchise that was literally created as quickly as possible just to compete with how much money Halloween was making at the box office. Like, I'm not exactly seeing the connection there, but I'm not working on the show, so I am a very easy person to convince. Like, if I watch the first episode and I think it's great, I'm watching the rest of the show, you know? Thankfully though, this Crystal Lake show isn't the only thing we have to look forward to with the Friday the 13th franchise, because Sean Cunningham, as it turns out, is doing his own thing, and it actually sounds pretty cool. This was all announced back in January by Bloody Disgusting, and it's actually like 3 movie announcements in one, and all of them, I think at least, are pretty exciting. So in addition to a new movie called The Night Driver and a remake of the movie House, Sean Cunningham is teaming up with a director called Jeremy Weiss to make a new Friday the 13th reboot. The writer on the project, Jeff Locker, said obviously the prequel TV series has reignited interest about a new film, so we're hoping the surrounding excitement will inspire both sides to come together and give us Jason on the big screen again for the first time in 14 years. But we also have a plan B for a sequel to the original that we think fans will absolutely love and should avoid any legal entanglements. It should go without saying that immediately reading this, I got super excited, because while I'm not really familiar with the work of Weiss or Locker, the idea of them going into it with the intention of getting Sean Cunningham's side to work with Victor Miller's side to make a real Friday the 13th movie is awesome. It's so cool to see them acknowledge the lawsuit and what happened with the fallout of it, and also acknowledge the TV show and say, hey, we're willing to work together and make something really cool here. And I think that's great. And if they really wanted to get crazy, they could even connect this Peacock show to the new movie that's being worked on by saying, hey, if you want to know the origin of this rebooted Jason Voorhees, go check out the show Crystal Lake on Peacock. You'll get all of the lore there for this movie. But if you want to see the more simple idea of adult Jason Voorhees running around Camp Crystal Lake murdering people, then you've got the movie you can go see in theaters. And honestly, I think seeing the movie first would also drive people to go watch the show as well, because they're going to say, hey, how did everything get to this point that we're seeing in the movie? So yeah, I think it's awesome that they're using the original 2 movies as sort of a bounce board either way, and then they're going to build off from there. I just really want to know what the legal loophole is that they're working with, because if it's a Friday the 13th movie that takes place at a summer camp and uses Jason as we know and love him, but he's never called Jason, they never call it Camp Crystal Lake, like, you're really losing something there. And for that, if you want, we already have that with the whole Hatchet franchise that Adam Green created. I was honestly gunning for him to be involved with this new Friday the 13th, whatever it ended up being. I think the new team will probably do a great job, but yeah, I would have loved to see Adam Green's take on Friday the 13th. Regardless, it's great we have Hatchet. I just really hope whatever happens with this movie ends up being able to incorporate Jason in some way, and Camp Crystal Lake and Pamela and all the lore we already know and love, because it's been a while since we saw Friday the 13th, and the whole idea of bringing these slashers back is not only to bring in the old fans who miss them, but also make new fans of these movies, right? Like, get new people interested and excited about slasher movies. So you want to make sure you're firing on all cylinders from the get-go, because if we get a new Friday the 13th movie and it's not financially successful, it will be a long time before before we get another one, which really sucks. The interesting thing here about the movie is that we don't really know who's going to distribute it. I think you could look at Universal for a second and say, oh, A24 is making the show, but they're distributing it through Peacock, which is owned by NBC Universal. So if the show is going to be connected to the movie, then maybe Universal would be distributing the movie. And we did just see a tweet from Jason Blum that big news is coming. So you can make a connection there between those dots. But I personally think this will probably end up back at Paramount. I personally would like it if the movie ended up back at Paramount, just because Paramount's been doing a really good job lately with their movies, between Top Gun Maverick and Scream 6, both I really loved. I'm super excited for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning. I think it's going to be great. So yeah, I'd like to see Paramount actually get back onto making Friday the 13th movies again, because it was always cool seeing the Paramount logo before those movies. And I would guess that they have some sort of rights retention since they made the remake back in 2009. I don't really know personally, obviously, because I'm not involved in making any of this stuff. But yeah, if it was going to end up anywhere, I would guess it would probably be distributed by Paramount no matter what. And I'm sure hearing that the movie might not end up at Universal is probably making a whole lot of people happy after Halloween Ends. Like, I loved Halloween Ends. I'm being real. You can go watch my reviews. I understand why a lot of people don't love Halloween Ends and would like to see Friday the 13th end up at a different distributor. And honestly, I can't blame. Now, in the last video I made about this subject, I got a ton of comments, like seriously over 100 comments from people asking if the game can come back because this lawsuit is over. They're making new content in the franchise. Honestly, a very fair question to ask. I asked a lot of my sources, and from what I've heard, I'm not really like willing to say I totally believe this just yet, but from what I've heard, the door is opened, or at least like open a crack for someone to come back and remaster the game, or at least pick up content where it left off. So maybe we could finally see the Jason X content for that game. Now, obviously Gun Media is like full steam ahead on their Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, which actually looks incredible. I'm super excited for that. I think it's going to be great. But after that, and after whatever DLC obligations they have are fulfilled, it would be really cool to see a next-gen re-release of the Friday the 13th game that also fixes a lot of the bugs. Like, they're working with a different developer on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game. I think it's Sumo Digital. So yeah, if they do a good job in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, I would love to see a remastered or remade version of Friday the 13th end up over with them versus IllFonic, because I don't know, I've played a lot of the games IllFonic has made since Friday the 13th, and I wasn't super into most of them, right? Like, I put enough time into Predator Hunting Grounds where I said, this is not great, and I didn't really even bother with the Ghostbusters game that they put out. I heard it was okay, but if you compare how those games look to what we're seeing from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, like, it's seriously night and day. And of course, all of the stuff we're talking about, whether it's a game, a TV show, or a movie, it could all come out and crash and burn. But regardless, I'm excited just to get more Friday the 13th content. I really want new slashers to come out as well. I say this all the time, I thought Halloween and of course Hellraiser coming back and Scream, all of those would kind of generate new slashers. I think we will see that when all the stuff that people love to call elevated horror, as much as I hate that term, starts to become boring to people. And I think we're kind of hitting that point where people are kind of getting over it, which isn't anything against that subgenre. It's just been over a decade of getting a lot of those movies on streaming services and in theaters. So yeah, I feel like people are ready for something new. And if the box office success of all three Halloween films is anything to go by, I think we have some really cool stuff to look forward to in the future. But yeah, that's all I got for you on the Friday the 13th franchise. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And maybe go check out my Scream 6 spoiler review as well. All of it is linked in the end card, I guess down in the description. It's over on my channel page as well. Just click around there. You might find something cool. Anyway, guys, as always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.